This is my regular sourdough starter, equal parts flour and water, because that's how it's supposed to be, right? Well, Hendrik from the Bread Code suggested in an old video to make a liquid sourdough starter. Supposedly, this will give the flavor of my bread less acidic notes and more dairy notes because of the lactic acid. So with this video, I wanted to try to make a loaf of bread from my own liquid sourdough starter. My main point was to see if this could even be done, and I also wanted to see if it gave the bread any noticeably different flavor in the end. So following the Bread Code's general guidelines, I made my own liquid sourdough starter. First, I fed my regular starter and got it nice and active, and then I got out a new clean jar, into which I put 25 grams of this active sourdough starter. This is much like my regular feedings, but the flour and water content here is going to be really different for this feeding. With the 25 grams of starter in the jar, I added an equal amount by weight of whole wheat flour. So 25 grams of flour, nothing too different there. Here's where things get interesting though. I'm adding 5 times the amount of flour in water, so 125 grams of water. This is going to be really wet and soupy. I've never fed my starter this way before, and it kind of just feels wrong, but I know that in theory this is going to work. The sourdough starter is going to eat away at the food, which is the flour, and allegedly the really liquidy starter is going to create an anaerobic environment, which favors lactic acid production over acetic acid production. So in theory, the final bread should have more dairy notes and less acidic notes. But hey, I'm no scientist, I'm just trying to make a loaf of bread, so let's see how this works. As I left my sourdough starter out overnight, I was pretty sure it wasn't going to rise or anything like that, but I still put a rubber band on there anyway. I covered up the top loosely with a lid, and I was hoping to see some kind of bubble action the next morning. And sure enough, the next morning there was not just bubbles, but it was really foamy on top. I'm assuming the top layer was flour that had filled up with CO2 gas and risen to the top of the liquid. So that was a good sign that this starter was ready to use, and there were even more bubbles than I was expecting, to be honest. So I gave the starter a good stir to incorporate everything, and I started mixing my bread dough. This recipe that I'm using, which I'll include in the description, is a modified version of my standard sourdough bread recipe. I need to modify it because there's so much more water in this starter than my usual starter. So I added 168 grams of this liquid sourdough starter to the bowl, then 163 grams of water. Then I followed that with 10 grams of salt. I used kosher salt, but any kind of good salt will work fine. Then I gave those ingredients a stir just to dissolve the salt into the water and starter mixture. Then finally, I added 463 grams of bread flour. That brought me up to the same proportions as my regular loaf of sourdough bread, 70% hydration. Or so I thought. Then I just mixed the dough together until it formed a shaggy lump of dough like this. And that's when I remembered why I'm so glad I didn't major in mathematics. The dough didn't feel right, it felt too dry, so I did some recalculations, and turns out I forgot 50 grams of water. So I added 50 grams of water back with the scale, and then I just squeezed it into the dough the best I could. A lot of people don't like to do this, but it's really not that difficult. If you forget some water, you can add it later. You can get it into that dough with your hands. So from here on out, I just followed my standard procedure for making sourdough bread. It's pretty straightforward. I covered up the dough and let it rest for 30 minutes. Then I did one set of stretch and folds to get the dough a little bit of structure, a little bit of gluten development. I just went around the bowl about 12 to 16 times, stretching and folding the dough over itself until I felt the dough tighten up a little bit. The dough was a lot smoother than before already, so I just put that back in the bowl, covered it up, and let it rest for another 30 minutes. Then I did another set of stretch and folds, just like the first one, and I followed that with another 30-minute rest. Then for the last set of stretch and folds, I actually moved the dough to this oiled glass bowl, which is something I like to do, so I can see through the sides and see how much the dough is growing during bulk fermentation. Flattened the dough down and covered it up, and then I just waited and hoped that this liquid starter would actually work. I let the dough bulk ferment at room temperature on the counter for about 5 hours, and sure enough, it rose. I let it rise until about this point, not quite double in size, before I decided to shape it. For the pre-shape, I took the dough out onto the counter and just gently shaped it into a round with my hands, into a round boule. I rolled it around like this a few times, creating tension across the top of the dough. After the pre-shape, I let the dough relax on my counter for 30 minutes uncovered. Then a half hour later, I gave it its final shape as an oval for the shape of my banneton basket. I put some flour on top, flipped it over, and teased it out into a rectangular shape like this. I folded the right third over the middle third, and then that left third over the middle third as well. Where the crease met in the middle, I pressed it down to stick. Then I rolled the dough into itself into a nice sturdy cylinder shape like this. But I wanted to fix the ends a little bit, so I folded the flap underneath the loaf on each side just to clean it up. There we have a batard. To get ready for the proofing stage, I flipped this out into a rice-floured banneton basket upside down. I pinched the seam closed a little bit just because I wanted to, and then I covered the dough up with a kitchen towel and I let it proof at room temperature on my counter for 2 hours. Then a half hour before I was ready to bake the bread, I preheated my oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit with the Dutch oven inside. Then after the 2-hour room temperature proof, this dough was looking nice and puffy, light to the touch, and ready to bake. Then to make the bread code proud, I got out a previously used piece of parchment paper that's a little bit bigger than my dough. You can reuse these. I find that you can use them about 2 to 3 times before they become a little bit too brittle to use. Then I carefully flipped out the dough onto the parchment paper and brushed off a little bit of the excess flour that was still on the top. Then like I usually do, I scored this with a razor blade from one end to the other, just with one long slash at a shallow angle, and I moved it to the oven to bake at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes with the Dutch oven lid on and 12 minutes with the Dutch oven lid off. The bread baked up really nicely, it had good oven spring and a nice golden brown color. Up till this point, nothing really looked different about the loaf compared to the loaves I make with my regular 100% hydration sourdough starter. So it was possible to make a loaf of sourdough with a liquid starter, but what I still wanted to know about was the flavor. Would the taste of this bread be any different than the taste I was used to for my regular sourdough bread? Would I get any dairy notes, any milkiness, or yogurty flavors from this loaf? Without doing a side-by-side taste test, I can pretty confidently say that yes, this did taste different than my regular sourdough bread, but no, I really wasn't getting many dairy notes. But the good news was I really wasn't getting any sour notes either. This was a sourdough bread that didn't taste sour whatsoever. It didn't smell sour either, just in case you were wondering. Maybe my liquid starter was just too young. I think that based on the advice from the old bread code video, if I would keep maintaining my sourdough starter as a liquid starter, always feeding it a bigger proportion of water than flour, that's one way that I could potentially convert my starter into a more lactic acid friendly starter, one that creates more dairy notes in the bread. Well, that could be an interesting experiment to try. I just want to know what you think. Have you ever tried a liquid starter before? Have you used a stiff starter, or do you usually stick with a 100% hydration starter? Let me know what you do in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.